Hey guys, so in this video we are going to build this grid layout here using Elementor and just some custom utility classes to make it work for us. It's a really good way of laying out content in a consistent 2D grid. There is no UI for this in Elementor, so it needs to be done with custom CSS or external CSS. I've created some utilities which I'll link to in the description, and this is the utility classes here, so it's not a huge amount of CSS, but what it gives us is some responsive and non-responsive gaps. It gives us utility classes to set the number of columns we want in our grids, and our column span and row spans for items. And the number of columns that we want in our grids here. We've also got some breakpoints here for what I've called tablet portrait, which is 768, mobile landscape, which is 650, and mobile, which is 478 pixels. And then we've got some gaps down here, which are utility classes that we can add to change the way our gaps work. Right, so not a lot here, but what we're going to look at is how we apply these in Elementor and how we can override them to do whatever we want to do. So we're going to start with a blank sheet here, so a blank editor. Right, so there's our editor there. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we want to add a section. We're just going to add a straight out section, and we're going to leave it as box, so we've got a central section. Now, when you do this in Elementor, when you're boxed, you actually get an outer section which goes full width, and then you get an inner section which is implied. Elementor adds it. You don't have access directly to that. So that's the first thing we need to know. Now, the other thing is that with my CSS, external CSS, I've got some rules in there so that if we make it a actual semantic HTML section, we automatically get padding. Strangely, when you change the tag here in Elementor, it doesn't actually update in the UI until you do an F5. So I'm just going to do an F5 there. And you'll see that we now have some padding top and bottom because we made it a semantic section. All right, now what we're going to do is add a container inside there. And with that container, we want to make it so that it is a full width container. Full width container adds a single DOM element that we're going to use for our grid. If we add a box container, it adds an additional div underneath that, which we don't have access to. So my general rule with Elementor containers is your outer containers that need to span the full width, and you want a box view is a boxed container. Every other container that you use within that is got to be full width so that you get the direct access to that div with no additional divs added below it. Now, the other thing they do in Elementor by default is you get a 10 pixel padding around everything. So what I've got is a utility class. To get rid of that, you can just go into your advanced and just set your padding to 0. So we've got no padding around that because we don't want additional padding on this container. I have an additional class which we can add. We won't do that through this because it's not what this is about, but you can easily, if you go to your advanced, where's our classes? I've got one called FP0, so my framework, padding 0. Okay, and that gets rid of the padding. So if you don't want to go into your advanced and do that, I've got a few utilities which I use for that. So in this case, I don't want to confuse things. I'm just going to set my padding in the UI here to 0. So I've got a container with no padding on it. Now what we want to do is turn this into, let's say we start with, say, a 4-column grid. So heading over to that CSS, look down here further, we've got F grid. So I use F for framework. So F grid cols 4. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to stick that into my classes here. Okay? And straight away you see Elementor has shown me that I've actually got my subcontainer is actually already 1/4. Now I'm going to now add another container inside here. And again, we get a padding. That's okay on this one because we're going to use that in our grid anyway. So we're going to have some padding on the inside. Now, I'm going to just put a border on that so we can actually see it. Solid border, width of 1, and a color of, I don't know, make it our accent color. So we get a nice bright color. And I'm going to bring up my navigator here so I can see that. And I'm going to call this inner container here my grid. And I'm going to call, I'm going to call this one the item. That's just a standard item. Might just grab some Bob Ross lorem ipsum. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but this is brilliant, this Bob Ross lorem ipsum. So just grab a few lines from here. And I'm just going to put a text editor in there, and I just prefer Bob Ross to all this random lorem ipsum stuff. Okay, so we've got a basic item with some text in it. What I'm going to do is duplicate that now, and duplicate it again, and duplicate it again. And what you'll see here is that when I duplicate it a 5th time, it goes to the next row, but it's exactly the same 2D grid, because we've got on this grid here, just above it, we've got f grid calls 4, which in our CSS is telling it that we want to be a grid. So this class up here says anything that starts with grid calls is going to be a display of grid, and grid calls 4 says we want 4 equal columns, and we want to use our normal gap. Okay, so that's simply adding that one class to that has made this a 4-column grid. If I want it to be 5 columns, all I have to do is change that to 5. Now I've got a 5-column grid. Okay, so if I now duplicate this again, it'll add it to the 5th column. Now, let's say we want this last one to span across, maybe we'll make that span across 3. So what we do is go to the CSS, and I think I put the spans at the top here. We're going to do a grid row span of 3. Column span, sorry, we want the columns to span 3. I'm going to do a column span of 3. I'm going to go to that item and add my CSS class to tell that to span 3 columns. So you can see here, it automatically sizes right to the very pixel all 3 columns. Okay, I'm going to add an extra, I'm going to duplicate that, and that wraps around because of it's too wide. If we go back to this one and change the col span to 2, it now fits perfectly into that 5-column grid. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to make that a 1. So I'm going to take the col span off it. Take that off because we only want to span 1 column. I'm going to go to this one up the top right here, and I want that to span across 2 rows. Okay, so I go back to my class system here, and I get a row span of 2. Copy that, go to my advanced CSS classes, row span of 2. So you can see here, the first 4 are just a straight out item with no spanning. The 5th one, I've told it I want to span across 2 rows. 6th one, I've told it I want to span across 3 columns. And then the 6th one, we've told we just want it to span just the 1 column. So in one row, 1 column. So we're doing a fairly complex grid layout just by adding these classes. Now, what happens when we drop down to our tablet mobile sizes? So I'm going to have a look at that. So if we look at the responsive mode here, and I go to my tablet, which is 768 on here. Can't remember what I set my rules down here to. Have a look. 768 is the max width. So we've got one here, a breakpoint, to go to one column on portrait. What I'm going to do for my grid is add that to my grid. If I go one column on portrait, oops, I mustn't have copied. Copy. I tell them I want that grid to drop to one column on portrait. It does, but what's messing this up is all the spans that we've got in there that are trying to span more than one column when we've only got one column. So what you need to do is, if you want to drop to a different column count on a different device, we need to make sure that on that device all of these spans here are removed. So if we go to this one here, which is spanning across two rows, go back to our what have we got? Our gaps. I've got a rule here. At the moment, this probably needs a bit of I don't have a rule here, so I might create another one. This is only at 650 pixels, so it's going to be a bit hard to describe here. So what I might have to do is bring up a different display. So what we're going to do is drop our grid spans to 1 on mobile. If I add that to that span, 1 span on mobile. The other one we did was this one. We say we only want to span 1 on mobile. We need to get this down. I don't know if we can do that in here. I think we have to go to all right. So I want to go back to the grid, and we want to add our breakpoint in here. Maybe we'll use the same one for here. So I want to go to grid mobile landscape 1. So 1 column on mobile landscape. We're going to add that class in there. And when we get down to under 650 pixels, you'll see that the grid has gone to 1 column, and we've removed the spans of each of these other items. So just going back here, so for example, this item here, we've got spanning 3 columns and spanning mobile of 1. So span 3 columns. Where that's creating a problem is if the main grid drops to 1 column, but this item is trying to span 3 columns, it messes up the grid layout. So if we're going to drop the parent, I guess, container of that down to 1 column, we need to make sure that the items in that column are not going to try to extend beyond 1 column. Does that make sense? I hope so. All right, so there we go. So we can drop that down to mobile, and everything's in 1 column on mobile. All right, so let's go back to our desktop screen. Now, the other thing with this grid is that we can change our responsive gap. So by default, Elementor puts a 20 pixel gap on these, and what we want to do is override that. So let's go back to our classes. Down the bottom here, I've got some gaps. So we can put a gap none. I'll show you what that'll do. We'll go to our main grid. I'm going to add an extra class in here, which is a gap of none. Now that's collapsed. All of them are right up against it. This could be really good for doing post-grid layouts where you've got the featured image, etc. So to set the gap to none, I've got small, go to small. Okay, so now we've got a small gap, and I'm going to show you my responsive settings. So I've got responsive small, responsive normal, responsive large. I'm going to use my responsive normal. Okay, responsive normal. So that looks typically the 20 pixel grid on desktop view. We go down to our mobile view, do a less spacing. If I go up here, we get to a point where we've got, it's actually dividing by, at this breakpoint, it's dividing by 1.5, so it's not quite 20 pixels. And if we go down to mobile, it's dividing it by 2.5. Where's our 468? There we go. Yeah, so it's dividing it by 2.5. What we end up with was a responsive gap between our elements or our items, which I like. I think using up less space for spacing when you've got less space on the screen just makes sense. All right, now the next one we're going to look at is putting a grid inside a grid. All right, now, so in here we can do that. I mean, you can manipulate this, and Kevin Powell's got a really good YouTube video on working out how many rows and columns you need, and you can do a lot of layout in here without creating multiple grids. With these classes, it's going to be easier to do it as a actual grid. So I'm going to get another container and put it in here, and we're going to set that to full width. I'm going to take the parent container, I'm going to set my padding to 0, so I don't want any padding on that. We might actually do the same on this one as well. This container, ooh, selected properly. No, it hasn't selected the container properly. As full width, there we go. And we'll set the padding on that to 0 as well. And let's make this a grid. Okay. So go back to our grids. We want this to be maybe a 2-column grid. Actually, let's make it a 3-column grid. So we're going to grab our if grid equals 3, head over to our grid. We'll call this a inner grid. And we're going to add our class here, turn that into a grid. We're then going to grab a container side there, make it full width. Remember, every container should be a full width, except for the outer containers. We'll put a color on this, so maybe we just pick a text color there, and we'll put, say, what are we going to put in there? Let's put in a basic text editor. Okay. Now, I've now got inside this item here, which is a grid item that's spanning across 3 columns. Then added another container inside of that, and I've told I want that to be a 3-column grid. Got a container here, which is my item inside that grid. If I duplicate that, duplicate it again, and duplicate it again, I've now got a 3-column, 2D 3-column grid within that. Now let's say this is going to be photos in here. So we head over to our classes here and our gaps. We want to get our gap none. Okay, so we go back to our inner grid and we add the gap none. So we get no gap. Now it looks a bit weird because I've got the borders around it. What I might do now is change the color of this one. See it a bit more. Maybe I might change that to secondary variation. So now that's different. Actually, might change the center one as well, so we can see what's going on. Make that a accent variation. Okay, so now we can see where the grids are. Now, let's say we want this bottom one to span across those 3. I'll go to the item, back to my CSS, go to my spans, and I want to span that by 3 columns. Back to my item here, I think I'm on the item, I am, advanced, and we're going to span that by 3 columns. So now it's spanning across these 3 here. We don't want it 3, we want it across 2. Whoops. We've got 2 columns, so it's only spanning those 2 columns, and maybe we want this one to span 2 rows. So I'm curious if we make the first one span 2 rows. Let's have a look at that. So if we go row span 2, curious as to how it will shift this grid if we do that. So I'll go click on the first one, I'm adding my row span 2. There we go. So it just shifts it across. So my first one is taking up 2 rows. My last one is taking up 2 columns. Don't like that. I want the last item, span, advanced, chuck it in there, and now my last item is taking up 2 rows. Okay, it's simple as that. It's pretty cool. So you can get responsive grid layouts in Elementor, even though there's no UI for it. Now, I'm going to show you one other thing, which is how you can override the default the default columns. So what I'm doing is I'm basically in my CSS, I'm making my rows as a repeat, with each row being 1 fraction. Each column, I should say. Getting my rows and columns around the right way. So what I'm saying is my grid template columns is a repeat of 4 times 1 FR, which is basically the same as writing 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. So 1 fraction each, so each one is 1/4. What we can do is override this on a per item basis. I'm just going to grab that particular property and head back over to Elementor and go to this inner grid here. Let's say I want this this last column here to be a little bit narrower than the other 2. So I go to my grid, go to my custom CSS, and type in selector to select the targeting of that DOM element, which has got the grid on it. And we're going to put in our grid template columns. And we're going to do this time, we're going to do maybe 2 FR, 2 FR, 1 FR. All right. Now what that's doing is that's saying it totals these up. So we've got 2, 4, 5 total. So the first column is 2 fractions. So 2/5, 2/5, 1/5. Right. Let's say we want the middle column to be a bit wider. We might make that 3. So now we end up with 3, 5, 6. Okay. So now that is 2/6. The second column is 3/6 or half, and the last column is 1/6. So you can override these, basically add your grid class to it. So whatever grid class you add to that, so any one of these grid classes here you can add, because you're going to override those by setting them in this selector anyway. So complete and utter control. You do need to be aware that if you do this manually, you're going to have to manually override this at the breakpoint. So you might add a media here of a max width of say 768 pixels. We want to drop that down in here. We want to drop that down to just 1 FR. And what that's doing is it's telling it at 768 pixels, we want all of this to be 1 FR. We've got this layout here, we've got 5 across. This item spans across 3 columns, and the last item, or this item, the fourth, what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth item is spanning across 2 rows. So a lot to go through, a lot to explain, but it shows that you can do grid layouts in Elementor. It just takes a little bit of work. You need a grid system like this to make it work. Otherwise, you'll do a lot of manual CSS in Elementor. I'll share this CSS file. You can modify breakpoints, add your own CSS, go for your life, but it certainly makes it possible. So hopefully that's something that you find useful, and if you do, please hit the subscribe, please hit the like, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you.